Okay. Hi, so this is going to be a summary sort of version of how to run a People's Assembly for students as part of the Waltham Forest Climate Summit week. My name's Emily Purser and I work at Waltham Forest Council as one of the Climate Action Outreach Coordinators. So, as I mentioned, this is part of the Waltham Forest Climate Summit, which will have resources and talks on all of these different themes throughout the week. This People's Assembly session is designed to potentially fit with the Climate Action Is Day, which is the Friday session. So for Friday, the theme is Climate Action Is, and we're really encouraging students and teachers to be thinking about what climate action means for you. So particularly in today's society, climate and ecological issues being such an important conversation, it's really important that we find ways of discussing these and kind of having discursive and kind of democratic ways of discussing and also making decisions around climate solutions. So one way that we'd like to sort of recommend that you could do this is through using People's Assemblies, which can be a really useful tool for encouraging group discussions. So what is a People's Assembly? People's Assemblies are kind of a democratic exercise that allow people to share thoughts, feelings and discuss problems and generate solutions. So there's quite a specific structure to People's Assemblies, which we'll go through briefly in a moment, but they, I think, essentially provide a really useful outline, a kind of format for a meeting that means people can really feel included in the conversation. It gives people a structure for how to discuss topics in small groups. It's a really inclusive way of bringing in lots of different voices. They can be used for really large groups or smaller groups to discuss all different sorts of topics, and a way of really including often people who maybe don't feel confident to kind of speak up in a big group. It gives a way to include all voices. They've been used throughout history and all over the world as a means to enable people to come together and achieve real social change. As far back as in ancient Athens, mass assemblies were used to make major decisions, such as going to war and kind of public elections. And more recently and closer to home, many local councils, for example in Frome, have actually used People's Assemblies to make decisions about how their public funding is spent. So they can be used in like lots of different democratic situations, but they're also just really useful as a sort of everyday tool for bringing people together and discussing issues that are relevant for the people that are present. So just a few sort of specific reasons about why they're particularly useful for school groups. As I kind of already mentioned a few of these things, they're really inclusive, everyone can be heard, small groups can really encourage more open discussions, and you can use, they can be applied for varying group sizes, and a useful way of teaching about democracy, particularly participatory democracy, and a way for people to take action. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of how to run a People's Assembly. So we'll talk first about the 3 pillars of an assembly. We won't do the active listening exercise just in this summary, but we'll also just talk about the structure and the format of the event and some other considerations that you can use for maybe using this for different situations. So there's 3 main pillars that a People's Assembly is based on. So these are radical inclusivity, active listening, and trust. So the assembly differs from a debate where one person is right and one person is wrong, or other kind of typical discussion formats where it's more of a sort of Q&A situation. Assemblies are more of a kind of open space where each participant can really be respected and listened to without judgment. So that's kind of speaks to that first pillar that I mentioned, the radical inclusivity. So the emphasis is really on being heard and valuing every single voice. So the idea is that no individual voice sort of prioritizes or is dominated amongst the group, so that then you can really kind of like harness the collective wisdom of the group, and people feel like they can participate safely and openly without sort of the fear of judgment that might come from speaking up in a larger group in other situations. So one of those one thing that kind of is important to consider when considering when kind of working towards radical inclusivity is being aware of any potential barriers to engagement. So that's things such as disabled access, sign language, just making sure that any barriers that might be present for anyone in the group are considered, and that people feel comfortable and able to participate well. So that's, you know, the kind of physical considerations of the meeting, but also some the design and the way that you're sort of introducing the meeting. These are, I guess, things that you would be considering in all formats for People Assembly, but obviously in the classroom situation, they're things that might be already underway, but good to kind of like have, I guess, this like kind of checklist of things to consider when running a People's Assembly in different situations. So the second pillar is active listening. So this is really focusing on hearing someone all the way through before developing any responses. The idea being while someone is speaking, everyone else is really listening. They're not interjecting or kind of even really asking questions. It's allowing each participant the space to speak clearly and to kind of articulate their views. This can be done by kind of really making sure you've kind of framed that at the beginning of the assembly, but also by giving people, for example, there can be a time limit for how long people can speak for, so that you can really ensure everyone gets a chance to speak, so that you don't sort of run out of time at the last minute, so and like leave someone out at the end. So that's a way of making sure that everyone gets heard, everyone has the opportunity to speak, and that we really prioritize listening, empathizing, and like giving everyone the space to share their views and concerns. The final pillar is trust. So once you've agreed the process for your People's Assembly, so based on these kind of suggestions here, you can design the exact kind of format and structure for your particular assembly. It's important that all participants trust the process, and that's sort of the role of the facilitator, through explaining clearly how the assembly will run, and through kind of going through these guidelines and creating that space where people feel like they can really speak clearly and openly, and that the other participants are going to listen. That sort of creates the trust of the in the process and for the assembly. So the kind of structure, it's not meant to be a sort of perfect. It will never be sort of like completely slick, but I think if the idea being, if you create the trust and the kind of structure of the process, it means that people can feel open, and the best decisions and actions can be kind of drawn out of the assembly. So now just a little bit about the structure of the assembly. So there's 3 parts to a People's Assembly in terms of the actual kind of like format of it. So there's the input section, deliberation, and integration. So the input section will vary slightly depending on what type of assembly you're running. So the assembly can be used for a few different purposes. It can be either to to come to a decision about something, to kind of decide which action to take. It can be to just deliberate and kind of gather ideas around a particular topic. It can be to kind of explore, the specific course of action, or to just simply kind of delve a bit deeper into a particular topic and kind of like gather the ideas from the group. And depending on which sort of avenue your People's Assembly is taking, that might affect the input that you give. So that can be either someone kind of an expert giving some overview about the topic. The facilitator can be like framing the question or framing the kind of parameters of the conversation. So that all comes into the input section, as well as the facilitator giving the overview of the timings and the instructions and the framing for the assembly. So each assembly, as I just mentioned, needs a facilitator. It also needs a note taker, and they'll be recording the feedback at the end of the session. One thing to consider for the input section and for the facilitator is to really carefully consider the question that you pose to the assembly. It's helpful for that to be kind of quite clear and concise, so that everyone kind of clearly knows the outline of what they're meant to be discussing. Sometimes, it's helpful to have almost the parameters in the box so that you can think outside of it, but having that kind of clear guideline at the beginning, I think helps to kind of create more fruitful discussions. The question can be either designed by the facilitator or the group, or you can kind of canvass opinions like within the assembly as to what question people would like to discuss. So the next section,
I just had a thought on the input, in terms of sort of how it might fit into a classroom setting. I guess it really depends whether you're trying to do something within one lesson or over a longer period of time, like making it a project. But I think sort of examples of that might be if you've got a topic around food waste or other sort of catering, packaging or something, the sort of people you might want to be able to get to input. And this can be up to the students to try and arrange this, but you could have somebody that works in the kitchens or is like the business manager, or even sort of trying to get some input from an organisation that works on food waste or the council, sort of thinking about who are going to be the people that have a bit of added information to give to the group on that topic. So there's a bit of sort of research and investigation that can be done by the young people to sort of even work out what that input is that they need in order to kind of go forward and discussing it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think there's a possibility for being quite creative in that input section. Also, we're talking about this in the context of the Waltham Forest Climate Summit. There's also some resources and videos that we've put together that can be used throughout that week, but can also be used kind of afterwards. And you could even show one of those videos as the input section as sort of one example. And yeah, as I said, that can be sort of really tailored to whatever the topic is that you are deciding to kind of like focus on for the assembly. So once you've sort of set the framing and given the input for the assembly, the next section is the deliberation phase. So in this stage, it's about moving into small groups to discuss the inputs and kind of really focus on the discussion around the question, whichever question that was given for the People's Assembly. Depends on how big your group is, but we can recommend groups of around 6 to 8. And within those groups, everyone takes turns to speak. As I mentioned before, it's really about that kind of, the rest of the group will be listening and each person can kind of take turns to share their ideas and inputs around that question. One thing that I'd recommend is to use hand signals, because that can really help to communicate in the group without people kind of interjecting. So the first hand signal is just your finger up, which is just that to indicate that you'd like to speak next, that you'd like to take your turn to speak after the person that's speaking. The second one is just the C, which is for clarification. So if you don't really understand something, or you want the speaker, whoever's speaking, to kind of elaborate a little bit on a point, just put your hand up like this to kind of get a clarification. And then the final one is just wave your hands up in the air, which is just to show that you agree or you support, so that you don't have to interject with whoever's speaking to kind of just to agree with them. You can just kind of quickly show that you support what they're saying. And those just really help to let the conversation kind of flow in those small groups a bit more easily, and they can be used in the wider assembly as well. So once in these small groups, it's really useful if each group can have a facilitator and a note taker within their small group. So that can just be assigned amongst that group. Someone just decides that they're going to be the ones to kind of take note of the hand signals and to make sure that everyone is speaking, has a kind of fair turn to speak. So that'll be sort of doing the timekeeping and just kind of keeping an eye on the whole group to make sure that everyone's getting a chance to speak. And then one person just to take some notes of what the kind of key points of the discussion are. That's really helpful for the next final phase, just if a note is taken of those kind of key points and that kind of like outcomes of the discussion. The kind of notes that are needed will depend a little bit on the question that's being asked. So that's another thing for the kind of facilitator to think about. What are the outputs that are going to be needed? It might be that there's a clear decision that needs to be made, in which case it will be more of a yes, no, do you kind of agree on the decision, or what do you think the course of action could be? But if it's more of a broad question, looking for kind of ideas or just kind of thinking around a topic, it might be that the note taker summarizes the top 3 points from that group discussion. So there's a little bit of kind of nuance and creativity or structuring that can be done just by the facilitator or by the group as a whole as to what outputs are actually needed from the discussion. Then once you've kind of had a sufficient time for the small groups to kind of discuss, and obviously these timings and things will completely vary on how much time you have available, how big the groups are, but at the end of that kind of discussion and deliberation period, the whole assembly comes back together to integrate that feedback. So this is like a really important part of the assembly, where each of the small groups gets to hear from each of the other small groups, and it's a way the kind of smaller groups in the deliberation phase are a way of, you really feel like you can kind of be a bit more open in a smaller group, and kind of everyone gets to kind of share their thoughts and opinions. But then we get to summarize large numbers of opinions and ideas in the wider assembly by just hearing from one person from each of the small groups. So it's important at this point, and again, depending on time, but generally that this is kept fairly succinct. So each group will be given an opportunity for a spokesperson to summarize their key points that they kind of discussed. So that would, probably look like, however many, if you had maybe 5 different small groups that had been deliberating, one person from each of those groups, so 5 people, would speak, summarising the kind of outcomes of the discussion. And the note taker for the whole assembly will take note of the key points from those smaller groups. So then what you come up with at the end is a sort of a summary of either the kind of decisions that would have been made, if it's a real sort of like yes, no, we support this point or not. So either you might come up with that, or a list of like the kind of key ideas that kind of emerged from those groups. So you'll have a kind of summary of all of the points that were made by all of the groups, and then the final phase is that the note taker and the facilitator can kind of summarize and synthesize all of those points, and then depending on what the purpose of your People's Assembly was, that will determine the next step. So it could be that what you actually wanted was a just a big list of ideas, and that will have really generated that. And then it will be down to the organisers of the assembly to determine what needs to happen to that output. So that could be to kind of influence a decision of the next steps, or to kind of like make a decision of what actions might be taken by the group. So for example, I guess in this case, it might be thinking about what pledges the class or the school would want to take in terms of their climate action plan. So the outputs of the assembly could be used to kind of determine what the priorities are for the group in terms of what climate action to take this in the next term, for example. So this is just to sort of summarize, I guess, some ideas of what you might do for your assembly. So as I sort of I think sort of mentioned a couple of possible questions that you might ask for the assembly could be, what climate action should we take in our school, or what's your most ambitious idea for a sustainable Waltham forest? But it could be any question. You can kind of gather ideas from the class. There could be a kind of preliminary discussion as to what the question should be, or it might be based on some of the themes from the learning in the climate summit, or other things that you've been doing in class, and that can kind of form the basis of the assembly. And then really, this is a sort of just a brief overview of the structure of a people's assembly, but it can really then be used for a whole different number of purposes and reasons beyond this climate summit week. But Poppy, I don't know if there's any questions or things that you feel like it'd be useful to clarify further after that sort of whistle-stop tour.
The only thing I will add on to this slide is that it can be used also if you have an eco committee, or if you're trying to have thoughts from the students fed up to senior leadership about these questions, or sort of honour the sort of sustainability and climate themes. This is a way of enabling as many students in the school to have sort of the mass input filter up through sort of whatever tiers and whatever route it needs to. It's also slightly enabling people to also define like what it is that's sort of the question as well, like, and whose responsibility it is, and the sort of those things can be discussed. And perhaps if there isn't an eco committee, or it isn't on a sort of senior leadership team's list of things to be discussing, then maybe the question isn't what's the action, but who should be responsible for starting to take action on this. So there are different questions that can be investigated as well. I think that's sort of, and that kind of fits into this idea of like actually learning about democracy in a way that's sort of, we're used to a voting system of democracy, but this opens up a different option for that.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a really useful way of empowering people to really participate in the decision making, in the conversations. When I've been involved in people's assemblies, it's also like it's a really fun way of kind of like having those discussions and really kind of getting quite deep into different debates in a small group, but also it's a kind of a way that you can kind of clearly pass the ideas up the chain of, depending on what it is that you're kind of discussing or trying to influence, and having lots of people participate in that discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Emily.